today I'm going to be talking more about how Jesus sounds in John, continuing my series. The book on John that I wrote, The Eye of the Beholder, contains, as far as I recall, more in it on this topic of how Jesus sounds, Jesus' discourses, Johannine idiom, these issues in one book than any other book I've seen. And I did that for a reason, because that kind of argument has confused too many people about the robust historicity of the Gospel of John, including some Christians and some who have a conservative or evangelical label. So I really wanted to address that from many different points of view. But if you prefer to get your content by hearing or watching, I really want to encourage you to buy The Eye of the Beholder, but I'm also trying to make this content available here as well. As I mentioned briefly in the previous video on the myth of the 7 I am discourses, where we saw that there were, even at a charitable estimation, only 3 that correspond to a generic description of an I am discourse, I mentioned briefly that Dr. Craig Evans has tried to use the comparison of Jesus to Lady Wisdom, which you will find in a wider variety of scholars, in such a way that it calls into question the robust, recognizable historicity of at least certain portions of the Gospel of John. And if you followed up and saw the quotations from his debates with Bart Ehrman in 2012, you would see that he's making even broader statements there about the Gospel of John's genre and questions about whether it was intended to be historical. So today I want to talk about this notion of Jesus as being allegorical and looking like an allegorical figure in certain places, which calls their robust historicity into question. So I want to start, I'm going to read several quotes from Dr. Evans. I want to start with one from one of those 2012 debates. This was from the question and answer period. And someone in the question and answer asked him about the so-called long discourses, these lengthy discourses in John. We'll be talking more next time about length. And he addressed it again, and he had said some similar things earlier, but I'm going to read you a good chunky quote here. This is Dr. Craig Evans. On a historical level, let us suppose we could go back into time with a camera team and audio and video record the historical Jesus, and we followed him about throughout his ministry. I would be very surprised if we caught him uttering, I am this, and I am that, and one of these big, long speeches that we find in John. Okay, so I'm just taking a different tack, but I'm saying the same thing I said before. Indeed, he is. This aspect of the Gospel of John I would not put in the category of historical. It's a genre question. The real question then would be, do these from a theological point of view reflect an accurate theological understanding of Jesus' person, his accomplishment, what he's achieved, what he brings to his believers? Is he the light of the world? Is he the way, the truth, the life? Is he the bread of life? See? And that's what Christians can affirm. And then just a little further down, so you could say theologically, these affirmations of who Jesus is, in fact, do derive from Jesus, not because he walked around and said them, but because of what he did, what he said, and because of his resurrection. And so this community that comes together in the aftermath of Easter says, you know what? This Jesus who said these various things, whose teaching we cling to and interpret and present and adapt and so on, he is for us the way, the truth, the life, the true vine. He is the bread of life, and so on. And so that gets presented in a very creative, dramatic, and metaphorical way in what we now call the Gospel of John. Now, I want to say that's just really clear. He's not just saying, as he claimed later, that these speeches were not recorded verbatim. He's saying he does not put them into the category of historical. They are not recognizably historical. They are the adaptations of the community after Easter, in the light of Easter, and their expression of, theological truths, but that Jesus is for them the bread of life and so forth. It's very clear. And I want to put in here that we really must not allow later radical reinterpretations of what someone says. If he says it, there is no taking out of context here. If anything, when you watch both of the videos from beginning to end, there's even more to this same effect, very much calling the historical intent and presentation of the Gospel of John into question, except for some nuggets of historical information that are sort of embedded in there throughout, but then but as a genre, it's not historical, and especially these places where Jesus utters these I am sayings with predicates. We need to not try to force ourselves to say, oh, I bet he meant this completely different thing, because I don't want to believe that he meant this, or because later he reinterpreted what he said. I don't think that's a good procedure at all. Okay. Now, fast forward a bit to 2018, when I had a dialogue with Dr. Evans on the Unbelievable show, and he tried to sort of limit what he was saying to the so-called I am discourses, about 7, and we talked about that last time. But I want to see how he connects this now with the figure of Lady Wisdom and this idea of Jesus as appearing allegorical. Okay. So this is from the Unbelievable show, Dr. Evans. In John's Gospel, and this is one of the most distinctive features about John, is where Jesus just begins to speak at length. You have nothing like this in the synoptics in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. That is not true. We'll talk about that next time. But in John, Jesus will say, I am the light of the world, and he'll go on and on and on for many verses. Actually, no, he never goes on and on and on for many verses on the topic of being the light of the world. We saw that last time. Or, I am the bread of life. And he'll go on and on for many verses explaining what he means and in what sense he is the bread of life coming from heaven. I am the truth. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the good shepherd. These are the I am discourses. There are about 7 of them. Nope, there are not about 7. And they're very thematic. They're very theological. They have a very high Christology. And Jesus speaks, here we go, more or less as wisdom speaks. If you compare, for example, the book of Sirach, chapter 24, we're going to be doing that today, comparing the book of Sirach, chapter 24. Sophia, or wisdom, speaks this way also. And this is why many scholars see the Gospel of John as something of a hybrid. It's loaded with history. We have the historical Jesus. We have itinerary. We have places, real people, real events, including the threat to stone Jesus. But in the 2012 debate, he said he didn't think Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am. He responded that way to Bart Ehrman. So maybe they threatened to stone him, but we have probably important information about Jesus' ministry prior to the chronology that we find in the Synoptic Gospels, but there is this stylized speaking as wisdom for many, many verses in a row. Note that, stylized speaking as wisdom for many, many verses in a row. And this is where scholars suspect that the evangelist or his community have taken Jesus' teaching and fashioned these lengthy discourses so that it is teasing out in greater detail the actual meaning of Jesus' teaching as well as specific things that he said. So you can see the continuity there with the other quotation. And then one more quotation here about Lady Wisdom. Again, this is Dr. Evans in 2018. The I am way of speaking, I am this and I am that, and various attributes, is a feature we find in wisdom tradition, both in canonical scripture and outside in the approximate time, the century or two leading up to the church. And so that then makes us wonder, maybe John is taking Jesus' teaching, which you do find in the Synoptics, including teaching that perhaps is not found in the Synoptics, that's unique to that southern perspective in the Johannine community, and taking that teaching and presenting it as though Jesus was wisdom speaking. So once again, the idea is, just as he said back in 2012, that if you followed Jesus around with a video camera, you wouldn't see him recognizably saying these things. They derive from him, but not because he went around and said them. Again, I'm not talking about verbatim. I'm just talking about recognizably historical. Now, the first point I want to make is that we need to see what kind of rhetorical argument this is. And I mentioned this briefly last time. I want to develop the comparison a little more here. Here's the impression that Dr. Evans is giving. Suppose you were reading something that was supposed to be a biography or based upon the life of some real historical person, and he's a modern person, and at a certain point in the story, he's depressed. He's feeling depressed, and he's got people around him, and they're talking. And suddenly this character, this person that the biography is about, bursts out saying, "To be or not to be, that is the question, whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune." And he goes on for many, many lines, quoting Hamlet's soliloquy speech. Now, this is a comparison. That's not exactly what Dr. Evans is saying, but I think it's a pretty good comparison. And the audience doesn't comment on it, say, "Dude, what are you doing?" And he's not supposed to be drunk or something, like someone might do this when he's drunk. In other words, it's just very unrealistic, and it pops off the page at you that this person is speaking as Hamlet for many verses, many lines. That could make you suspect, because it's so unrealistic, and he doesn't even, verbally say, "Yeah, Hamlet had it right," or, whatever. He's just suddenly sounding like Hamlet. That the author, for some reason, has decided to fictionalize a little bit, has decided to dramatize and put Hamlet's to be or not to be speech into this person's mouth, when really he was just depressed at that time and said, "I'm thinking of committing suicide," or something. Okay, that's a kind of analogy. That Jesus suddenly in John starts sounding in this and talking in this specialized way, very stylized, which a reading or hearing audience of the time would supposedly have immediately recognized as especially Lady Wisdom-like way of talking, and would have said, "Oh yeah, that's not historical there. The historical Jesus wouldn't have actually started saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the light of the world." That's the way wisdom talks. So this is something where John is dramatizing or embellishing. That's the impression that's being given. And that's false. Now, there have been plenty of scholars who, rightly, wrongly, too much, somewhat, etc., have compared Jesus to Lady Wisdom as taught by John, especially the preface to John, "By him all things were made," and so forth. I'm not sure I'm on board with all of that, but the point is that doesn't need to go to this exaggerated extent of saying that Jesus literally sounds like Lady Wisdom in a suspiciously artificial way for many verses that calls their historicity into question. So just as we saw the last time that Dr. Evans was exaggerating with his 7 I am discourses, conflating 7 I am sayings with predicates, with long discourses, and kind of squishing those together. So here he's throwing another element on top. Oh yeah, there's this idea, Ben Witherington has a whole thing about Jesus's wisdom, and there's this theological idea that John thinks of Jesus as being like the divine wisdom in the Old Testament. And guess what? Says Dr. Evans, see, he talks for many, many verses in this strangely stylized way, and those are the about 7 I am discourses, and they look really odd and unrealistic and allegorical, as if Jesus suddenly appears as an allegorical figure. And that lumping things together and then exaggerating them gives an impression of specialized knowledge. It gives an impression also of limiting what he's questioning, which I think can be comforting to an evangelical audience. And it gives an impression that if you just understood the Jewish context, you would realize that they in their culture would have known that these sections weren't really supposed to be historical. And all of that is untrue. All of that is completely not true. So when I first heard that on the dialogue, I went and I did a lot of further research. I read all the passages, in Proverbs 8 and 9, in the canonical gospel, Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 8, and Wisdom of Sirach, 24. And I just read them, and I'm looking for this I am with predicate way of speaking. Now, there are plenty of similes that the Lady Wisdom uses. We'll be hearing those in a moment. But I wasn't finding anything that sounded to me like I am, and then a predicate after that. I am this and I am that. So I wrote to C. Jack Collins, with whom I'd had some contact before, Old Testament scholar. And I asked him, what is this about? This idea of a special I am this and I am that Lady of Wisdom way of talking that makes Jesus sound like an allegorical character. And he wrote me back, and later he gave me permission to quote this in the Eye of the Beholder. He wanted me to quote the context of what he was saying so he wasn't misunderstood. And I'm doing that. So let me read what he wrote, Dr. Collins. First, there is, as far as I know, nothing distinctively wisdomish about the combination ego e me. In fact, this combination is not frequent in Proverbs and Wisdom of Solomon and Sirach. Proverbs 8:30 hardly establishes a style. Proverbs 8:30 is where Wisdom says that she was with God, at the time of creation. The combination of words is clear enough, so there's no reason to associate the words with a particular style or way of speaking. Second, even should there be such a style, I have no idea how that leads to the conclusion that we are free to discount the likelihood that Jesus actually said these things. So I guess he would put them in the category of historical. Third, I do think, that the personification of wisdom in Proverbs 1 through 9, added with a number of other factors, does underlie New Testament Christology. I have argued in print, for example, that it lies behind the hymn of Colossians 1. But if that's true, there's no reason why Jesus wouldn't have known it of himself and said so. So he's talking about Jesus alluding to himself as wisdom or greater than wisdom historically. Not, he sounds like wisdom in this suspiciously artificial, stylized way for many verses that makes it look like this is a creation of the community. Okay, so Dr. Collins is confirming what I found when I looked. Now, Lady Wisdom does praise herself, and what we're going to find is, when you look up these passages, which I encourage you to do if you're interested, both Lady Wisdom and Jesus say a lot of really praising, strong things about themselves. That hardly amounts to a special literary style. If Jesus really was God, we can expect him to say some strong things about himself if he was coming to teach who he was and to emphasize the importance of himself, which is one of the most salient features of all the Gospels. And therefore, it's historical. It's part of who Jesus was. Who am I? Who do you think I am? And so forth. And they both use figurative language at times to speak of themselves. Jesus comparing himself to a vine or a door, and so forth. And then we'll see Lady Wisdom comparing herself to all these different plants and things that have sweet smells and odors and all of that. So metaphoric language or figurative language and praising yourself, that's not enough. And we're going to find a couple of brief and incidental similarities that, in one case that I think Jesus himself at one point in John 6 may be alluding to Lady Wisdom, but not his speaking in a stylized way as Lady Wisdom for many, many verses. That's not what we find. So I want to read you, part of my goal in this channel is to train your ear. So I'm going to read you this passage from Wisdom of Sirach 24. I don't have anything to hide. This is the passage that Dr. Evans was alluding to. Lady Wisdom speaking, beginning about verse 13. You can actually find this on Bible Gateway. It's in Protestant Bibles, it's not a canonical book, but it's part of ancient Hebrew wisdom literature. I grew tall like a cedar in Lebanon, and like a cypress on the heights of Hermon. I grew tall like a palm tree in En-Gedi, and like rose plants in Jericho, like a beautiful olive tree in the field, and like a plane tree I grew tall. Like cassia and camel's thorn I gave forth the aroma of spices, and like choice myrrh I spread a pleasant odor, like the fragrance of frankincense in the tabernacle. Like a terebinth I spread out my branches, and my branches are glorious and grateful. Like a vine I caused loveliness to bud, and my blossoms became glorious and abundant fruit. I am the mother of beautiful love, of fear, of knowledge, and of holy hope. Being eternal, I therefore am given to all my children, to those who are named by him. Come to me, you who desire me, and eat your fill of my produce, for the remembrance of me is sweeter than honey, and my inheritance sweeter than the honeycomb. Those who eat me will hunger for more, and those who drink me will thirst for more. Whoever obeys me will not be put to shame, and those who work with my help will not sin. First thing I want you to notice here is that the Lady Wisdom in that passage is piling one simile on another briefly. The very characteristic of the I am discourses, the approximately 3 that there are, is that Jesus develops a metaphor for himself, or in the case of the door of the sheepfold and the good shepherd, 2 that are interwoven with each other, for a number of verses. In other words, ironically, the very characteristic that makes a I am discourse is absent from the very passage that Dr. Evans referred to. Instead, what she's doing here is she's just kind of simile bombing, we might say. Simile after simile after simile. I'm like this, I am like this, I am like this, to give a certain feeling or impression. Now, what is that feeling or impression? It is an impression of attractiveness, beauty, sensory lushness, desirability, and fertility within herself. It is, if I may say so, a very feminine passage, very much so. This is in a culture where plants are valued, especially tall trees and plants that give forth sweet smells, and odors and spices are valued, very Eastern. And she's comparing herself in verse after verse to all these different strong, lush, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful plants, fruitful plants, and so forth. I hate to say, you can't picture Jesus if you really understand Jesus in the gospel saying, I am the mother of beautiful love. Okay, unless you're some kind of crazy feminist theorist whose ear is made of tin. You need to hear that, the femininity and sensual nature of this, and the varying similes, the constantly varying similes are part of that. Now, I wavered on how much to read of John 6, which is contains perhaps the most classic I am discourse in the Gospel of John, the one that actually comes right after a miracle, the feeding of the 5,000, and Jesus does speak at length about a given metaphor for himself, that he is the bread of life. He repeats that metaphor repeatedly throughout, and so forth. And because this video is already kind of long, I'm not going to read the whole thing. I tried that when I was practicing it. I thought it was too long. But I really want to encourage you to get out your Bibles in a good modern translation and read John 6, 22 through at least verse 66. And I'll be drawing some points about this. And similarly, John 15, 1 to maybe 15, the true vine. Because she compares herself to a vine. Woo, she compares herself to a vine. Jesus sounds like Lady Wisdom for many, many verses. Well, no, So in John 15, when he compares himself to a vine, it's not that he is beautiful and his fruit is luscious and all of that, and he has all these, beautiful flowers on him or whatever. When he compares himself to a vine, he says it's because his followers are dependent upon him, and his strength is needed, and without him they cannot bear fruit. And he develops that they need to abide in him, just like the branches need to abide in the vine in order to bear fruit. And he develops that at length, rather than saying, I'm beautiful, I'm desirable, I'm like a vine, I'm like a terebinth, and so forth. So, go and read that, see that for yourself. If I may say so, it's much more masculine. Similarly, in John 6, the people come and ask him to, give us bread again. And, hey, our fathers ate manna in the wilderness. And of course, they got manna every day. So they're like, hey, do it again, Jesus. And Jesus launches into, I am the bread of life. And he's emphasizing, again, his authority, his power, and he's issuing a challenge to them to believe on him. Instead of portraying himself by sensuous metaphor upon sensuous simile in such a way to say, come to me, come to me. He says come unto me, but, he that comes to me I will not cast out. But I'm so beautiful you should desire me. He's saying, you have to have me. I will raise you up at the last day if you believe in me, if you eat my flesh and drink my blood. And you need that in order to have eternal life, okay? If you don't do this, you don't have life in you. Very similar theme in that sense to the need for the branches to abide in the vine. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I want you to see that challenging masculine sound in the development of a single metaphor over time, over a space, rather than the sound of the Sirach passage. So once again, what we're left with is figurative language and self-praise. And one place where I think Jesus himself may be alluding to the wisdom passage, John 6:25, Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall not hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. She says that if you partake of wisdom, you will hunger for more and you will thirst for more. And he, kind of turns that around. And that may very well be the historical Jesus actually alluding to wisdom. Now, I want to notice some other really important contrasts here, and I don't want to miss any of these. I have them in my notes. Okay, I've done numbers 1 through 3, number 4. All right. The historicity of the bread of life discourse in John 6 is made very clear in many ways by the interruptions of the crowd, the portrayal of it as historical. Remember, the idea is supposed to be that this kind of pops off the page as being unrealistic and a clue and a hint to make us go, maybe it's not intended to be in a historical genre. But that is false. In fact, John emphasizes the historicity of it in multiple ways. He leads into it with the realistic discussion of the manna in the wilderness and their desire for Jesus to do that again. Then, after he says, I am the bread of life that came down from heaven, they interrupt him. John 6:41. The Jews therefore were grumbling about him because he said, I am the bread that came down out of heaven. And they were saying, is not this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How does he now say, I have come down out of heaven? So they're saying, we know your parents. You didn't come down out of heaven. You were born. This is ridiculous. Okay, so they're commenting specifically on what they at least believe to be his historical ancestry. As I said in The Eye of the Beholder, somehow this never seems to happen to Lady Wisdom. There's no audience because it is an allegory. I mean, if you know what an allegory is where the characters actually have names, like Pilgrim's Progress, Giant Despair, and Christian, and Mr. Valiant for Truth, and the Valley of Humiliation, and it's like obviously not historical, but this is embedded in its historical context to such an extent that, so far from looking like an allegorical character, Jesus' figurative language for himself is questioned precisely because of beliefs about his historical ancestry. And this is in Galilee, where it's in Capernaum, where he was raised in Nazareth, but not that far away. And people are like, we know who your parents are. There is also a comment on the metaphoric nature of his speech. They interrupt him again. Verse 52, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? Okay? This would be, to go back to my Hamlet metaphor, as if this guy was a little drunk and he stood up and he starts quoting Hamlet and his friends keep interrupting him and saying, dude, sit down, enough with the Hamlet. I think you need a cup of coffee or something like that. Then you might say, maybe this really happened because it's integrated into a realistic history indicating context that could really happen. So they're offended. How can he give us his flesh to eat and blood to drink? Again, there's nothing like that in the allegories of Lady Wisdom in any of them. She is, there's no audience that's saying, hey, you're just, Miriam who lives near the well. What are you doing walking around calling yourself Lady Wisdom? Obviously not, because it really is just a poetic allegory. So it's just all wrong. It's allegorical Jesus is a myth. All right. And they also challenge his authority. It's what I call a crisis of authority. It's a historical crisis of authority, because not only do they challenge his and are offended by his words about eating and drinking, but it says in verse 66, as a result of this, many of his disciples withdrew and were not walking with him anymore. They were that offended. John emphasizes in the narrative the impact that these words historically had on his audience, how he had fewer followers, and then he goes and turns to his 12 and says, will you also go away, which leads into further discussion with them. It's so historically grounded. Also, emphasis on location for the I am sayings and discourses. These things, verse 59, John 6:59, he said in the synagogue as he taught in Capernaum. The most you get in some Lady Wisdom passages are, by the crossroads or something like that. She's speaking because she wants, to cry out to people, and wants them to hear her. But of course there's no historical tie down like synagogue at Capernaum, because it's not intended to be historical, but this is. In fact, archaeologists believe they've even potentially uncovered the synagogue in Capernaum where Jesus gave this sermon. And then for some of the I am sayings, like when he says, I am the light of the world, he heals the blind man and he sends him to wash in the pool of Siloam. Emphasizes that. And we believe we actually found the pool of Siloam. Or when Jesus is comparing himself to the good shepherd, my sheep hear my voice. This is said in Solomon's portico at the Feast of Hanukkah in the winter. Very, nailed down. Josephus refers to Solomon's portico. So these emphases on location show the historical intention. I want to emphasize, too, the connection to the words of institution in the connection to the words of institution in the Synoptic Gospels, the institution of the Lord's Supper. Now, I don't want to get into theology here. You don't have to accept any kind of sacramental view to take the point that I'm making here. But if you do take a sacramental view, you you can also take the point I'm making here. My point here is that this particular language for himself, you have to eat his flesh and drink his blood, is something Jesus uses at the Last Supper as reported in the Synoptic Gospels in a act and in words that were undeniably intended to be historical and were undeniably taken by the early church to be historical. Paul, in the night in which he was betrayed, he took bread, and when he had blessed it, he brake it and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." The entire ordinance or sacrament or Eucharist, whatever you want to call it, of the Lord's Supper was taken up by the Christians from earliest times as a rite which they carried out because Jesus had historically said these words. So this means that in a completely different context, we have evidence that this is the way Jesus spoke of himself historically. He used this kind of language of himself historically, which indirectly confirms that when he calls himself the bread of life and says you need to eat of his flesh, drink of his blood, that this is plausibly also historical. It's not him sounding like Lady Wisdom and therefore he looks like an allegorical character and we should suspect it's the creation of the Johannine community any more than the words of institution of the Lord's Supper, "Take, eat, this is my body," should be considered to be him looking like an allegorical figure and be the creation of a community. Okay, so I really want you to see that this idea of an allegorical Jesus just fails on point after point after point. And I want you to see that it's integrated into the rest of the gospel rather than popping out looking like an unrealistic, unhistorical portion. Now, skeptics, of course, will say, well, yeah, said it was historical, he made it look historical, but he was making it up, but he was trying to make it look historical. But I want you to see that my foil here, rather, is scholars and thinkers like Dr. Evans, who are trying to imply that these passages don't look like they were intended to be historical, that they draw sort of suspicious attention to themselves by being so literary. And that can create, especially for Christians, a false notion of security that we have some kind of third way. In my book, The Eye of the Beholder, I have a title of a section, Hoaxer or Historical Witness, the Johannine Dilemma. That either he really is who he presents himself as, a historical witness, giving you real history, or he's hoaxing. He's trying to fool people. And there is no third way. There is no third option. No. It's a genre question. And he's making it look like Lady Wisdom so that in their time they would have been able to tell that it wasn't intended to be historical. No, that's not open to us. John has not left that open to us, and he did not intend to leave that third option open to us. Now, to counter the idea that he was a hoaxer, we have all kinds of other evidence about the reliability of the Gospel of John. But the main point I'm making in this video is that there is no question that he is trying to convey the historicity even of these I am such and such, I am with a predicate, sayings and discourses based on them. Now, you're not going to find this content anywhere else on the internet in this form. That doesn't mean I'm not grateful to other scholars. D.A. Carson, for example, emphasizes that when an author portrays something as happening at a particular time, we should take that seriously, that context. But this particular application of it in this way to the Gospel of John is something that I think I'm giving as an original thing, where I'm really emphasizing this. So I hope that you will invite others to subscribe to this channel. If you haven't subscribed, why not? Go ahead, please like and subscribe, or head over and become a listener at the Anchor FM audio version. Thanks very much for watching throughout this entire, somewhat longer broadcast today. And next week, I'm planning to do the myth of the monologuing Jesus. So come back next time and hear that.